He refused to stand in front of the judge because he believed she was beneath him. The billionaire laughed at the poor, until he heard the sentence that made him turn pale. Post in the comments, where are you watching from? In the cavernous courtroom of the Jefferson County Courthouse, where polished wood and subdued murmurs of justice created an atmosphere of solemnity, all eyes were fixed not on the unfolding legal proceedings but on one man whose very presence disrupted the expected decorum of the judicial process. Ethan Grayson, a billionaire notorious not only for his vast fortune but also for the sinister criminal schemes that had siphoned millions of dollars from ordinary American families, strode into the courthouse with the audacity of a man who believed himself above reproach. His tailored suit, custom-made and impeccably pressed, shimmered under the fluorescent lights, symbolizing his wealth and power. Yet his most striking accessory was the smug, self-assured smile painted across his face, a silent declaration of his perceived invulnerability. Ethan's entrance was as dramatic as it was disdainful. As he walked confidently down the marble corridor to the courtroom, he barely spared a glance at the assembled spectators, lawyers, or even the bailiffs. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept contemptuously over every face in attendance. When he reached his seat, a plush leather chair reserved for dignitaries and high-ranking officials, he unceremoniously dismissed the murmurs of admiration and awe that naturally arose in his wake. It was clear to all that Ethan Grayson felt no obligation nor any desire to conform to the expected norms of modesty or humility. In his mind, the city's courthouse was nothing more than a stage upon which he could display his contempt for the common man and flaunt his absolute dominance. As the courtroom slowly filled to capacity with families, journalists, and curious onlookers, the proceedings took a dramatic pause with the entrance of Judge Monica Lee. Judge Lee, a resolute and distinguished woman known for her unwavering principles and formidable courtroom presence, commanded respect the moment she crossed the threshold. Clad in a traditional black robe that stood in stark contrast to Ethan's ostentatious attire, Judge Lee's measured steps and dignified bearing exuded an authority that few could challenge. Yet, as she made her way to her bench, all eyes naturally fell upon Ethan. In an act of deliberate defiance, he remained seated, his posture relaxed as if the courtroom were his personal playground, and he unashamedly refused to rise in her honor. A hush fell over the room. The air was electric with tension. Court protocol dictated that every defendant and most visitors should rise in the presence of the presiding judge as a sign of respect and deference to the legal system. However, Ethan's calculated refusal was a brazen challenge, a public display of arrogance that left no doubt about his belief in his own untouchability. In that charged silence, Judge Lee's eyes flashed with a reserved intensity. She had encountered hubris before, but never with such deliberate disdain. Though her expression remained composed, the piercing gaze of her dark eyes spoke volumes, even if her lips remained tightly drawn in professional reserve. In her mind, this was not merely an act of disrespect. It was the overt manifestation of a man who had exploited the vulnerable, having enriched himself at the expense of countless American families for the mere thrill of power and avarice. Whispers rippled through the hall as Ethan mockingly shifted in his seat, his hands casually resting on the polished surface of his desk as if to underscore his unconcerned attitude toward authority. His legal team, ensconced in their high-rise offices and accustomed to his unpredictability, exchanged subtle glances but said nothing. They knew all too well that Ethan was accustomed to pushing boundaries, both legally and morally. The case against him was not merely about financial transgressions. It was a symbol of systemic exploitation, a flagrant assault on the dignity of ordinary citizens. His actions had left scores of families homeless, struggling to rebuild shattered lives, and casting long shadows of despair over communities that once thrived on hope and solidarity. Judge Monica Lee, however, was unfazed by his theatrics. With quiet determination, she took her seat at the bench, her presence an unyielding reminder that the law, though sometimes slow and imperfect, was relentless in its pursuit of justice. In that moment, as the courtroom waited in suspended silence, Judge Lee's gaze locked onto Ethan Grayson. Behind her thoughtful eyes lay the empathy for the countless victims of his avaricious schemes, but also the firm resolve to restore order in the face of unchecked arrogance. She did not yet speak, but her silence was a portent. Ethan's time of unchecked humiliation was drawing near. The stage was now set for a trial that would captivate the nation. The audacious billionaire's disdainful performance and his blatant disregard for the solemnity of the court were about to be weighed against searing testimonies of loss and hardship. And as the proceedings began, it became abundantly clear that what unfolded in that courtroom on that fateful day would not only determine Ethan Grayson's fate, it would reshape the nation's sense of justice and serve as a powerful reminder that no one, regardless of their wealth or influence, was above the law. The courtroom was immediately abuzz with an energy that straddled the fine line between indignation and anticipation. As Judge Monica Lee took command of the proceeding with a quiet, steely authority, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The prosecution wasted no time. Their opening arguments painted a picture of ruthless greed and the systematic exploitation of everyday Americans by Ethan Grayson. Detailed accounts emerged, testimonies from families who had lost their savings, witnesses recounting the irrevocable damage to their lives, and documents meticulously compiled to expose the multimillion-dollar theft. In stark contrast, Ethan Grayson lounged at the defendant's table as if casually awaiting his lunch, his smirk widening with each scandalous revelation. From the outset, Ethan's contempt was unmistakable. When the first witness, a middle-aged woman, her voice trembling as she described how her family's home had been foreclosed after her life savings were siphoned off, stepped up to testify, Ethan's dismissive scoff was audible. He leaned forward, his tone mocking, punctuating his derision with sarcastic laughter, as if the woman's sorrow were nothing more than trivial misfortune. "You really think they can keep your lousy house?" he jeered, his eyes flashing with unrepentant arrogance. His comments rippled through the court, eliciting gasps and outraged murmurs from the audience. Yet, despite the rising fury, Judge Lee maintained an unyielding silence, her expression inscrutable yet profoundly determined. Witness after witness took the stand, each narrative more heart-wrenching than the last. There was the father who had watched helplessly as his teenage daughter's future crumbled amidst mounting debt, and the elderly couple forced into homelessness after years of hard work were rendered destitute by Ethan's calculated schemes. Every testimony was a stab at the conscience of the courtroom, each word etched with a palpable mix of despair and hope. Even as the courtroom air grew thick with emotion, Ethan remained defiant. When questioned by the prosecution about his role in these tragedies, he leaned back in his chair and offered flippant retorts, glancing about the room with a self-satisfied expression that dared anyone to challenge his authority. At one point, the prosecution called a financial expert who explained in excruciating detail how Ethan's fraudulent practices had laundered millions from the savings of ordinary families. With graphs, spreadsheets, and vivid comparisons, the expert demonstrated that what was presented to the public as investment opportunities were nothing but elaborate cons targeting the most vulnerable. Ethan, rather than showing any sign of remorse, interjected during a break with a haughty remark to one of his attorneys. "This is nothing but juvenile theatrics. Numbers can be twisted, and I'm the smartest man in the room." Even as his words dripped with hubris, the evidence against him grew ever more damning on the sterile screens and paper trails that he couldn't hope to disparage with mere words. Throughout the day, Judge Monica Lee meticulously absorbed every detail. Although her face remained impassive as she listened to the barrage of emotional testimonies and mounting evidence, there was an undercurrent of resolve in her quiet interjections. She allowed Ethan's arrogance to spill forth, knowing that each contemptuous remark, every light-hearted sneer at the misfortune of others, was a piece of the puzzle reinforcing his guilt. The judge's measured questions and particular attention to inconsistencies in his statements hinted at a careful strategy that would soon pivot the momentum firmly away from the defendant. The courtroom's tension was palpable. A silent promise hung in the balance that retribution and accountability were inexorable. During a recess, murmurs among the audience discussed how Ethan's demeanor was emblematic of a self-made billionaire who had condescended to treat the judicial process as though it were his personal playground. His legal team, seemingly uncomfortable with his brazen antics, exchanged furtive glances. Some even wondered if his overconfidence was a mask for deeper insecurities. But in Ethan's eyes shone nothing of human frailty, only an unbroken belief in his invincibility and a willful ignorance of the devastation left in his wake. As the second session resumed, the prosecution introduced an audio recording that captured the callous remarks Ethan made to a business associate, comments that detailed his scorn for the pitiful, pitiless individuals whose lives he had ruined. The recording reverberated through the courtroom, and for a fleeting moment, even Ethan's smug countenance faltered. But true to form, he quickly shrugged off the discomfort and resumed his habitual sneer, as if he believed the judicial system could simply be laughed off like an inconvenient interruption. Judge Lee's silence, however, was deafening. Her gaze, fixed and unyielding, seemed to challenge Ethan to continue his contemptuous charade, but he did not relent. In that charged environment, the courtroom had transformed into a battleground where the forces of raw, unadulterated human suffering clashed with the glacial arrogance of a man who believed himself a rightful conqueror of wealth and power. Every statement, every piece of evidence laid before the judge, was a denouncement of his systematic malfeasance, a stark counterpoint to his haughty assertions that the hardships of others were merely collateral damage in his quest for success. The hearing wore on with calculated intensity. With every passing hour, the scale of Ethan's crimes became more undeniable, and Judge Monica Lee's presence grew ever more commanding. Even as Ethan attempted to manipulate the proceedings with petty sarcasm and flamboyant gestures, there was a sense building among all present that the time of unchecked hubris was nearing its inevitable reckoning. The verdict, it seemed, was not only a reflection on the man standing in disdain but a promise to the countless lives that had been shattered by his actions. As the session ended for the day, the courtroom slowly emptied, but the sound of whispered outrage and quiet resolve lingered in the empty halls. Ethan Grayson sat alone in his chamber, his mind already turning away from the day's proceedings. Yet, as he rehearsed his next mockery, even he could not entirely disguise the faint flicker of uncertainty that passed through his eyes when he caught Judge Lee's unwavering gaze. It was the hint of a storm gathering, a storm poised to change the entire course of justice, not just for him, but for the nation that had entrusted its hope to the mighty but fallible hand of the law. As the trial advanced into its most raw and heartrending phase, the courtroom transformed from an arena of legal argument into a sanctuary for the anguished voices of those whose lives had been devastated by Ethan Grayson's greed. One after another, victims of his elaborate schemes rose to deliver testimonies that were as wrenching in their candor as they were unyielding in their demand for justice. Deborah Wilson, a middle-aged woman whose once bright eyes had dimmed under the weight of unimaginable loss, was the first to take the stand. Clutching a faded family photograph that captured happier moments, a wedding, the birth of her daughter, she recounted, voice trembling yet growing steadier with every word, how her family's savings were siphoned away under the guise of high-yield investment opportunities. In a voice cracking with emotion, she described the slow-motion collapse of her world. One day, I woke up to find that the only thing left in our bank account was a void, a nothingness that swallowed our hopes. Our home, our sanctuary, was foreclosed on, and our children were left with nothing but memories. I trusted the promises of a billionaire, and he turned our dreams into ashes. Her testimony was punctuated by a tremor in the silence that followed. A silence so profound that even the steady hum of the courtroom fans seemed to pause in respectful empathy. Judge Monica Lee's steely eyes fixed upon Deborah, as if silently promising that no tear, no sorrow, would fall on the part of the law. Deborah's words had laid bare the human cost of Ethan's actions. A family torn apart by a calculated theft that left them scrambling in the ruins of their shattered lives. Next, Michael Rivera, a father whose once proud demeanor was now clouded with bitter sorrow, rose to testify. Michael, a blue-collar worker from a small Midwestern town, recounted how his children's education was decimated by the financial ruin caused by fraudulent schemes propagated by Grayson's empire of deceit. With hands clenched into fists and eyes glistening with unshed tears, he spoke of the crushing guilt and helplessness he suffered as he watched his daughter, a once promising student, lose the opportunity to attend college, a future that had once brimmed with promise and now lay in tatters. I worked every day with sweat on my brow and hope in my heart, believing that I was saving for my children's future. But Mr. Grayson, with his lavish lifestyle and heartless greed, took not only my money but also tried to steal our dreams. My daughter's scholarship was nothing but a promise broken, a future denied. I have seen the light in her eyes dim, and I will forever carry that ache. The depth of Michael's pain reverberated around the courtroom, his words interlacing with those of the other witnesses to form a tapestry of collective suffering. Every shattered promise, every lost opportunity echoed as a denunciation of the billionaire's unrestrained arrogance. Then came the testimony of an elderly couple, Harold and Margaret Thompson, whose once cozy lives were obliterated when their modest retirement funds disappeared overnight into Ethan Grayson's labyrinthine financial scams. With both hands trembling as they held each other for support, they explained how the couple had spent almost a lifetime saving for a peaceful retirement, only to have it all snatched away by the predatory investments orchestrated by Grayson. Margaret's voice, thin yet unwavering, recounted the endless nights spent wondering how they would afford even basic medications, while Harold's quiet interjections spoke of shattered dignity and mounting despair. We gave our whole lives to working honestly. We thought our savings would secure our twilight years, a time of rest after decades of labor. Instead, we've been left to face each day with no safety net, no hope of relief, all because a man with insatiable greed decided our security was collateral damage in his game of profit, Harold said, his voice catching on the final word. Each testimony not only recounted financial ruin but also painted vivid portraits of lives upended. The testimonies revealed that Ethan Grayson's criminal actions were not isolated incidents of fraud. They were a series of calculated moves that had stripped ordinary citizens of their homes, dignity, and futures. The stories told in that courtroom were interwoven with themes of betrayal, loss, and the corrosive impact of unchecked power. Victims described how their entire communities had been shaken, with families forced into homelessness, elderly parents abandoned in medical debt, and children left without the promise of a proper education. Moreover, the emotional weight in the room steadily increased as more victims came forward. Each voice, though distinct in its personal tragedy, resonated with the shared suffering of hundreds of American families. For many, the courtroom became a brief sanctuary where their stories were acknowledged, and their pain was validated by the unwavering presence of Judge Monica Lee, whose silent, incisive gaze seemed to absorb every detail of the suffering laid before her. As the testimonies continued, the depth of Ethan Grayson's moral degradation became impossible to ignore. The very act of flourishing financially, if it meant the systematic looting of the dreams and means of the less fortunate, painted a picture of a man who valued wealth over human life. In the hushed pauses between speakers, the collective realization grew that a system which allowed such exploitation to thrive was complicit in the tragedy. The courtroom had transformed into a mirror reflecting a fractured society, one where the powerful could trample over the dignity of the common man with impunity. Amid the torrent of sorrowful accounts, there was one final, gut-wrenching testimony that encapsulated the true extent of the devastation. A young single mother, barely in her 20s, took the stand. Her eyes, red from sleepless nights and endless worry, met those of the assembly with a quiet, fierce determination. She spoke of how the fraudulent investments not only drained her savings, but also forced her into impossible choices between feeding her child or paying vital bills. Her voice wavered as she recounted the moment she had to choose between the warmth of a meal for her son and keeping a roof over their heads. "I stand before you not asking for pity, but for justice," she implored, her voice soft yet resonant. "I never imagined that my life, my little boy's future, would be used as a pawn in someone else's game of greed. I trusted the system only to have it betray us in the worst way. I'm here to say that our suffering is real, and it must end." Her testimony underscored the calculated cruelty behind Ethan Grayson's actions, turning what might have been seen as mere financial misdeeds into acts of deliberate human devastation. The raw emotion in her words left no doubt that every dollar stolen had a ripple effect, tearing apart families, fracturing communities, and erasing futures that should have been bright with promise. With the closing of each testimony, the courtroom fell into heavy, contemplative silence. Even as Ethan Grayson's arrogant sneers flickered on the defendant's table, The amassed weight of the victim's stories built an undeniable case. A case not just of legal wrongdoing but of moral abomination. Judge Monica Lee, listening intently to every anguished plea, absorbed the evidence like a surgeon preparing to deliver a verdict that would resonate far beyond the confines of that room. In that charged moment, the scale of justice began to tilt irreversibly toward the broken, betrayed, and downtrodden. The voices of the fallen had been unleashed as a force that could no longer be ignored, a force demanding accountability, restitution, and something far more profound, a reclaiming of dignity for every ordinary American whose life had been shattered by a man who thought himself untouchable. In the wake of the heartrending testimonies of the victims, so raw and painful that the courtroom trembled with the weight of their grief, Judge Monica Lee retreated, not into silence but into a meticulous process of reflection and documentation. In the solitude of her chambers, beneath stern portraits of past justices and the faded insignias of the court, she began to assemble the scattered pieces of evidence into a coherent and uncompromising narrative. Her hands moved with the precision of a surgeon as she pored over transcripts of every testimony, examined the myriad financial documents, and listened again to the recorded callous remarks of Ethan Grayson. Every piece of evidence was not merely a number or a fleeting word, but a shard of truth that reflected the lives shattered by his greed. Judge Lee's mind, honed by decades of exposure to the darkest facets of human nature, worked tirelessly to weave the individual tragedies into a tapestry of systematic injustice. For every tearful narrative of a family rendered homeless, for every whispered account of futures stolen, she saw not isolated events but a deliberate, calculated exploitation. Late into the night, with the courtroom empty and the corridors quiet, she sat at her desk in a study lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp. With calm determination, she reread the witness statements, noting the recurrent pattern. Ordinary Americans who had placed their trust in what they believed were legitimate investments, only to have that trust eroded by the callous machinations of a man who saw human misfortune as mere collateral damage in his pursuit of profit. Her eyes traced the lines of a meticulously prepared financial report, tables filled with staggering figures that underscored how vast sums of money had been funneled out of the pockets of hardworking citizens. With unwavering focus, she annotated margins in red ink, marking discrepancies, patterns of embezzlement, and deliberate obfuscation. She categorized each piece of testimony, grouping them by theme: the sudden foreclosure of homes, the cancellation of educational opportunities, and the emotional devastation that followed in Ethan Grayson's wake. It was a painstaking but necessary exercise in constructing an unassailable case of moral and legal culpability. Throughout her process, Judge Lee's inner voice resonated with the memories of similar cases she had presided over. Cases where justice had felt like a whisper against the roaring winds of corruption. But this case, she believed, was unlike any other. Here, the evidence pointed not to mere financial mismanagement or bureaucratic error, but to a pervasive, deliberate callousness that had systematically dismantled the lives of countless ordinary people. Ethan Grayson's arrogance, his derisive laughter, and his contemptuous dismissal of the courtroom's solemnity were all piecework in a larger mosaic of cruelty that could not stand the test of justice. As she compiled her findings, Judge Lee prepared a summary that would later be brought before the entire courtroom. Her document detailed the emotional toll exacted by the defendant's actions, a detailed account of every family lost, every future stolen, and every dream reduced to ashes by his high-handed manipulation. She did not merely report the facts. She crafted them into a narrative that highlighted the human cost of unchecked power. Each statement was interwoven with testimonies about shattered lives, a narrative that resonated with the stark reality of what was at stake. In her annotations, she wrote of the deliberate exploitation of trust, the indifference to human frailty, and the calculating cruelty that characterized Grayson's offenses. Quietly, with deliberate care, Judge Lee began drafting preliminary thoughts on the eventual verdict. She knew that the upcoming sentencing was not simply a formality. It was an opportunity to send a message that extended far beyond the confines of the courtroom. This was a turning point where the halls of justice would echo with the voices of those who had been silenced by greed. Her draft was relentless in its candor. It affirmed that the law was not a toy to be mocked by the affluent, and that no man, regardless of his wealth, could stand above the inherent dignity and rights of an individual. In her private notes, she reflected on a moment that had struck her during the trials. The icy, defiant glare that Ethan had directed at the bench, his arrogance laid bare in every dismissive gesture. That moment of insolence had stirred something deep within her, a fierce resolve to restore balance, not just in the case before her, but in the national consciousness that had, for too long, tolerated such audacity. She reminded herself of the names of the suffering victims, the forgotten faces of families and children whose futures had been callously snatched away, and with each name, her determination hardened. Justice for them was not a matter of legal technicality. It was a sacred duty. As dawn edged closer, the shadowy contours of the night gradually gave way to the pale light of early morning. In the cool stillness of her office, Judge Lee secured her notes, ensuring that every piece of evidence she had gathered would serve as an unassailable foundation for her upcoming judgment. She knew that Ethan Grayson's fate would not only be a statement about the enforcement of the law, but a declarative repudiation of a system that had once seemed to favor the mighty at the expense of the vulnerable. Her resolve was silent and formidable. The painstaking process of assembling the case had become a personal crusade. Judge Lee was no longer merely an arbiter of the law. She was an architect of a fair and empathetic justice. A justice that recognized that the courtroom was not just a venue for the exchange of legal jargon, but a space for the healing of society's deepest wounds. With every piece of evidence, every carefully cross-referenced testimony, she was building a fortress of truth that would stand against any attempt to undermine the sanctity of justice. The stage was set to face the final act, a moment in which Ethan Grayson, so brazen in his conviction of untouchability, would be held accountable. The full weight of the testimony, meticulously curated and presented by Judge Lee, promised to expose not merely a flawed individual, but the very fallacy of viewing wealth as an impenetrable shield against accountability. In these quiet hours before the next phase of the trial, the scaffolding of justice was complete, ready to uphold the voices of the fallen and ensure that no one would dare to belittle the sanctity of human dignity ever again. The courtroom's atmosphere grew even heavier as the witnesses' testimonies and Judge Monica Lee's late-night meticulous preparations converged into a singular, unavoidable moment. With every word of anguish, from broken families to dreams mercilessly stolen, echoing through the hallowed halls of justice, the tension was palpable. At long last, the time had come for Judge Lee to speak. With her eyes fixed on the gallery and her gaze unwaveringly set on Ethan Grayson, she rose slowly, commanding the courtroom's attention with a deliberate, almost sacred poise. A hush descended upon the room as every individual, from the visibly shaken victims to the silent, tense jurors and even the still defiant billionaire at the defendant's table, turned their eyes to the bench. Judge Lee's voice, when it emerged, was calm yet potent, a voice that carried the weight of every person whose life had been shattered by the defendant's greed and deceit. "Today," she began, her tone measured and deliberate, "this courtroom is not merely a chamber where legal procedures are followed and disputes settled. It is a sanctuary of truth, a place where the voices of those who have suffered are interwoven with the principles of justice to form a collective plea for accountability and compassion." Her gaze swept slowly over the room, pausing on each person whose testimony had invoked empathy and outrage alike. "We are not gathered here to simply assign blame in abstract terms, but to confront a man who has callously treated the lives of everyday American families as if they were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet." Her words clashed with Ethan Grayson's unrepentant smirk. For the first time in this trial, his aura of invulnerability faltered, as if the sheer force of Judge Lee's conviction reverberated through the very air he breathed. "Mr. Grayson," she continued, her voice taking on an edge that silenced even the murmurs in the back, "your actions were not merely financial transgressions. They represent an unwavering disregard for humanity. You orchestrated schemes that emptied bank accounts. You stole the hope of those who believed in a better tomorrow. Your greed created a chain of despair. Homes were taken, futures were crushed, and the very fabric of communities was torn asunder." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom, the collective heartache of the victims resonating in every whispered word from the gallery. Judge Lee paced slowly before the bench, each step measured and weighted with purpose. You walked into this building with an air of supreme entitlement, dismissing the dignity of this institution and the rights of the people it exists to protect. You scoffed at the memories of those you wronged, mockingly laughed at the suffering you induced, as if you were immune to the very consequences of your actions. Her tone was not a personal attack but a measured rebuke, a clarion call that the law and the moral compass of society had finally caught up with the unchecked arrogance you once considered your birthright. Her voice, resonant and unwavering, grew even more impassioned. Let it be known that the courtroom of this nation shall not serve as a playground for the rich, where wealth insulates one from consequence. Today, we affirm that every American, regardless of the number in their bank account, is entitled to dignity, to justice, and to a future free from exploitation. The evidence presented, the agonized testimonies of the victims, and every shred of deceit you have spun have been dismantled by the unyielding pursuit of truth in this court. A solemn pause ensued as her words hung in the charged silence, a silence that spoke of collective grief, resolve, and the promise of redress. Eyes glistening with unshed tears, survivors and families, then in attendance bore witness to how Judge Lee's words transcended the usual legal rhetoric. She spoke of the shattered lives, the father who lost his daughter's college fund, the mother forced to choose between a meal for her child or keeping a roof over their head, the elderly couple whose retirement was stolen by fraudulent schemes. Every dollar you misappropriated, she declared, was a bolt in the hammer that broke a family's spirit. Every scheme you engineered was a dagger to the heart of our society. At that moment, even the walls of the courtroom seemed to absorb her words, as if the very air had taken on the responsibility to remember the suffering inflicted by society's so-called titans of finance. In issuing this sentence, Judge Lee continued firmly, I am not merely punishing an individual for crimes on financial statements. I am vindicating the voices of those who have been silenced, and I am sending a message to every person who believes that wealth grants immunity from justice. The verdict I am about to pronounce is not just for Mr. Grayson. It is for every American citizen who has ever been made to feel insignificant, for every family that has had its hopes stolen by avarice. A weighty pause allowed her words to sink in. Every eye in the courtroom was riveted on her face, a face that was as resolute as it was compassionate. Her final message carried the air of inevitability, a promise that the systems protecting ordinary citizens would no longer bow to the whims of the wealthy. May this judgment be an enduring reminder that in the halls of justice, the dignity of the human spirit is paramount, and even the most arrogant among us will one day stand before the full, uncompromising force of truth. As Judge Monica Lee's piercing gaze locked on Ethan Grayson one final time, the defiant billionaire's steely veneer finally began to crack. His face, once the epitome of condescension, now reflected a dawning realization that his pride had not carried him beyond the reach of justice. The silence that followed was not merely the quiet after a storm. It was the collective exhale of a society determined to reclaim its sense of fairness. In that charged silence, as every person in the room bore witness to what could only be described as the dawn of true accountability, a spark was lit that promised to ignite a broader reckoning. One where the voices of the fallen could no longer be drowned out by ego or money, where the value of a human life was measured in more than profit margins. Judge Lee's solemn proclamation was more than words. It was the sculpting of a new moment in history, one that would forever alter the narrative of justice in a country desperate for reparation. In the charged stillness that followed her earlier powerful oration, Judge Monica Lee resumed her seat at the bench. The courtroom, having been steeped in the raw pain of the victims and forced to bear the weight of Ethan Grayson's hubris, now hung on her every movement as she prepared to deliver what would be the final, fateful address before the verdict was pronounced. Her eyes, dark and steadfast, swept across the room, not only taking in the defeated, furtive glances of the billionaire defendant, but also the strained, hopeful faces of those who had suffered immeasurable losses. In that moment, the entire hall became a nexus of human emotion and the promise of accountability. With a measured pause that allowed the collective silence of the room to crystallize the gravity of the occasion, Judge Lee began anew. Mr. Grayson, ladies and gentlemen of this court. Her voice, soft yet imbued with a gravity that resonated like a tolling bell, carried far beyond the confines of legal jargon. Today, we are not merely concluding a trial predicated on balances and ledgers, but confronting the deep moral corruption that allowed a man to believe his wealth could erase his responsibility for the devastation he wrought on countless lives. I stand here not only as this court's representative of the law, but as a voice for every unheard cry that echoes in every family whose dreams were shattered, whose futures were stolen by predatory greed. She paused, her gaze fixed on Ethan Grayson. The defiant billionaire's nostrils flared imperceptibly, yet even his impervious mask of arrogance betrayed a momentary lapse as Judge Lee's words pierced the veneer of his self-assured persona. You have treated our legal system as a stage on which you may parade your contempt with impunity. You have laughed in the face of families reduced to despair and dismissed the lives you've destroyed as mere collateral in your pursuit of profit. Understand this. This court exists not to placate the powerful, but to secure justice for every American whose life has been irrevocably marred by criminal exploitation. Her voice grew firmer, each syllable deliberate and unwavering. The legacy you hope to fashion, a legacy of unchecked ambition and the presumption of invulnerability, will not now stand unchallenged. The detailed evidence, the heartfelt testimonies, and the undeniable patterns of malfeasance submitted to this court all converge upon one inexorable truth. No man, regardless of his financial stature, may act with such disregard for humanity without bearing the full weight of the law. In that moment, the judge's speech took on a historical cadence. I am reminded, she declared, of the long and sometimes arduous journey of our system of justice, a journey that has, over centuries, sought to ensure that power does not become an end in and of itself, and that every individual, no matter how disenfranchised, is entitled to recover the dignity denied by the tyranny of greed. Today, this courtroom becomes the forum where that very principle is enshrined. Every fraudulent transaction, every shredded promise, has led us to this point. The rights of the people and the fundamental dignity of our communities have been undervalued for far too long. Her words, stoic and unyielding, sent ripples of quiet awe throughout the room. She continued, I hereby state unequivocally that the evidence will not only convict you on every charge brought before this court, but it will stand as a clarion call, reminding our nation that justice is relentless and that, in the eyes of the law, the lives of ordinary citizens are priceless. Our society cannot, and it will not, tolerate the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable, regardless of the size of the perpetrator's bank account. For a long, heavy moment, her words reverberated against the walls, melding with the collective heartbeat of those gathered. Judge Lee's voice softened for a fleeting second as she addressed the assembled jurors, lawyers, and civilians. Let this pronouncement not only serve as retribution for those wronged, but as a beacon of change for our entire judicial system. Let future generations know that the moment we rested not on the laurels of profit, but stood united in the name of human decency, was the moment we reclaimed the sanctity of justice. Her final declaration was both historical and personal. Mr. Ethan Grayson, you stand today before a society that has grown tired of witnessing crimes against humanity excused by wealth. Your arrogance, your blatant disregard for human life, has been exposed in every painful detail within these walls. The judgment I am about to render will affirm that no one can remain untouchable. Justice will be served for the forgotten, the broken, and the betrayed. In that charged silence, as every ear in the courtroom absorbed the full force of her words, a profound transformation rippled through the assembly. The defiance in Ethan's eyes wavered, replaced by a burgeoning dread, a realization that his once impenetrable shield of money and arrogance was now crumbling beneath the unyielding glare of truth and justice. Judge Monica Lee's resolute tone, imbued with empathy and the weight of countless unvoiced sorrows, had reshaped the very atmosphere of the courtroom. In that turbulent juncture between cruelty and compassion, the scales of justice tilted irrevocably toward the many over the mighty. Her speech stood as a testament, not only to the power of the law, but to the indomitable spirit of those who suffer in silence, reminding every soul present that fairness is not a privilege, but an inalienable right. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as Judge Monica Lee slowly resumed her position on the bench. Every eye in the room, from the tearful faces of victim families to the tense expressions of jurors and even the nervous, almost imperceptible twitch in Ethan Grayson's hardened demeanor, was riveted on her. After what had felt like an eternity of raw testimony and impassioned declarations, the time had come for justice to punctuate the proceedings with a final, unequivocal pronouncement. The silence was absolute. A stillness so profound it seemed to hum with the collective heartbeat of those seeking reparation for wounds inflicted by greed. Judge Lee's gaze, as piercing as it was compassionate, swept over the courtroom one last time before she began. Having heard the overwhelming evidence and the heartrending pleas of those whose lives have been upended by your actions, she intoned, her voice steady and resolute, I find you, Ethan Grayson, guilty on every count. The crimes you have committed against countless American families are not mere figures or abstract transgressions. They are acts that have irreparably shattered lives, eroded communities, and left behind a legacy of pain that will resonate for generations. Her words echoed around the chamber, reverberating off the walls like the tolling of a mighty bell summoning both reckoning and renewal. With each declarative syllable, the weight of those stolen dreams, of the homes lost and futures denied, pressed on the very air. In sentencing you today, Judge Lee continued, this court will not merely impose punishment. It will send a resounding rebuke to those who believe that wealth can circumvent accountability. Your actions have sown injustice on our nation's soil, and it is time for this court to reclaim what has been unjustly taken. The dignity, the security, and the hope of the victims. A palpable murmur of approval rippled through the room. The prosecutor's gaze was affirming, and the testimonies of suffering witnessed earlier glistened in the eyes of those who had braved the ordeal of recounting their personal tragedies. Families huddled together, some silently weeping, others gripping the arms of loved ones, as they dared to envision a future in which their pain would be acknowledged and justice restored. Even the seasoned legal minds in the gallery could not hide their respect for the resolute woman behind the bench. Judge Lee paused for a moment, her voice momentarily softened by the quiet grace of empathy, before delivering the final and binding sentence. Ethan Grayson, she declared, in addition to serving a term that reflects the enormity of your crimes, you shall be ordered to pay restitution that attempts, in no small measure, to redress the monetary and emotional damage inflicted upon your victims. Let it be known that today, in this courtroom, we reaffirm that every individual, no matter how powerful or wealthy, is subject to the law and must answer for crimes that erode the very foundations of our society. At that moment, the courtroom seemed to breathe as one united force, a chorus of relief, vindication, and somber resolve. Ethan Grayson, whose earlier arrogance had been as palpable as a tangible force in the room, now sat slumped in his chair. His face, once sporting a defiant, mocking smirk, was now devoid of its former invincibility. It was as if the weight of every shattered life, every stolen hope, and every moment of unchecked hubris had finally beguiled him. The persona he had constructed, impervious to reproach by the mere power of his bank account, was crumbling before the indisputable might of justice. As murmurs of disbelief and emotion swelled into a collective wave among the spectators, the silence of the verdict gradually gave way to an eruption of tears, anguished cries, and even small expressions of joyful catharsis by those who had long suffered in silence. Every person in that courtroom bore witness to the embodiment of accountability, a definitive moment that would blaze in the annals of legal history. Families of the victims, once resigned to despair, now allowed themselves to hope. The battered souls whose lives had been reduced to numbers in a greedy ledger felt, for the first time, that the sacred principle of justice had found its voice. Judge Monica Lee's verdict was not merely an end, but a new beginning, a seismic shift in how power and privilege would be held accountable in the public eye. Her resolute determination, her unwavering commitment to truth, had redefined the balance between might and right. It had rekindled a belief that no man, however rich or influential, could defy the impartial and relentless pursuit of justice. As the gavel came down with a reverberating finality, the silence that followed was filled with a potent mix of sorrow, hope, and the promise of systemic change. Journalists in the gallery hurried to record every word, and the cameras flashed, capturing not just a moment of legal triumph, but a transformative chapter in the nation's ongoing struggle for equity. In that charged, historic instant, the entire courtroom, and indeed the country, was forever altered. Ethan Grayson's destiny had been sealed, his once unassailable empire of exploitation brought crashing down by the resolute voice of a judge who had dared to stand for truth. The collective spirit of those who had suffered at his hands now surged forward with renewed vigor, a testament that in the face of overwhelming power, the unyielding force of justice could indeed prevail. The verdict was only a part of the truth. What Judge Lee said today became history, a story that changed our nation. Subscribe to the channel to witness how one powerful act of justice can break the walls of silence and pave the way for a brighter, fairer future.